Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining this talk about detecting kernel exploits with eBPF. My name is Guillaume Fournier. I'm a security engineer at Datadog, and I work with the cloud workload security team. So CWS leverages eBPF to detect threats at runtime in user space. And everything we do is embedded into the Datadog agent. What this means is if you are a client of Datadog and you want to try out CWS, all you have to do is update the Datadog agent config. All right, so let's go through the agenda for today. First, I'm going to give you a bit of context about what this talk is about. Then we'll go over the threat models that we are going to try to address. After that, I'm going to first talk about why eBPF. So it's like probably one of the main questions of this talk. Why use this technology to do these kind of detections? Then I'm going to talk about kri. So kri is an open source project that I will be releasing today. So we go down the list of features that kri has to offer. And finally, we're going to talk about performance and what overhead you need to expect if you were to deploy kri in a real-world environment. All right, so I'm pretty sure it will come as absolutely no surprise when I say that critical CVEs are regularly discovered in the Linux kernel. So it has nothing to do with Linux. It's just like perfectly normal in the life cycle of a software that is constantly being updated and that has thousands of users in the entire world. But the thing is, because of this, security admins worry about keeping up with security updates. Deploying those security patches, and if anyone here has had to deal with the dirty pipes vulnerability, you will definitely know what I'm talking about. Upgrading a kernel in the entire fleet of your infrastructure takes weeks, if not months. And in the meantime, well, you don't have any, you don't have anything to protect yourself. So basically, security admins worry about monitoring and protecting vulnerable hosts until they can actually deploy the upgrade. And this is exactly what this talk is about, and exactly what kri tries to address. There are technically hundreds of ways to exploit the Linux kernel, and this talk targets just 3 types of vulnerabilities. So the first one is, let's say that an attacker is able to redirect the execution flow within the kernel. Another one is logic bugs. So an attacker is able to perform something that he's not supposed to do because developers made a mistake somewhere, and the proper access control could not be called, and the operation was actually allowed by the kernel even though it shouldn't have been. And the last one is post-compromise kernel runtime alterations. So once an attacker successfully exploited your kernel, they are likely to try to alter the kernel so that they can hide their tracks and further compromise the services running on the host. All right, so the goal today is to detect and prevent these attacks with eBPF. Yeah, simple enough, right? Well, absolutely not. Those 3 types of vulnerabilities are way too ambitious, and it would be an utter lie if I was to say that kri was able to catch every single one of them. So what we are more realistically going to do is try to make attackers' lives a living hell. So yeah, again, we need to be very realistic about expectations and what you can actually do with eBPF in the spheres of detecting kernel exploits. So I've been talking about eBPF a while. So what is eBPF? So in a nutshell, eBPF is a way to run sandbox programs in the Linux kernel. So think of it as you have a C program that you compile into eBPF bytecode and that you load into the kernel using the eBPF syscall. So the kernel is going to perform a bunch of checks. Essentially, the goal is to make sure that your program is safe and that the kernel is not going to crash or do kernel panic or whatever because of your program. And then the second step is to actually attach your eBPF program to a hook point. So you have a bunch of different program types, a bunch of hook points. I'm going to go over a few of them throughout the talk. But just know that, yeah, you need to attach an eBPF program to a hook point for your eBPF program to actually get triggered. All right, so why eBPF? What are the reasons why this technology may make sense for this kind of projects? Well, the first point is eBPF has a relatively wide kernel support, depending on the eBPF features that you actually use. So as long as you do not use too fancy features, you can actually go back to, backport your detections back to 4.1 kernels. Another good thing about eBPF is that it has some safety and stability insurances that kernel modules might not have. It also has a rich feature set, which means that you have a lot of different ways to understand what the kernel is doing and what's happening in kernel space. And finally, if you are using a recent enough kernel, you have some write access and enforcement capabilities. So overall, eBPF has a bunch of pros going for it, right? But at the same time, eBPF is pretty much a terrible idea to do these kind of detections. The first reason why it's really not great to do kernel level exploit detection with eBPF is because detecting post-compromise activity is fighting a lost battle. So we're going to see why, in some cases, eBPF cannot catch an exploit pre-compromise. It's going to have to be post-compromise. And the point is, if you are relying on a compromised kernel to actually emit security events, well, you can't rely on these events to be actually legit and reliable. Like, they could be compromised as well. The other reason why eBPF is not a great idea for this is because there are dozens of ways to disable eBPF programs. What this means is it's going to be as important to actually write detections for whatever you're trying to detect than it will be to actually protect the eBPF subsystem and make sure that it's actually still enabled and still working, and it will trigger when you want it to trigger. Last point is eBPF can have a significant kernel space performance impact, but we're going to talk about this later. All right, so what's the point, right? Well, the point is script kiddies and out-of-the-box rootkits. There is value in trying to make attackers' lives harder and to try to make it harder to exploit flows within the kernel. And last but not least, in some very specific cases that we're going to talk about, detecting and blocking pre-compromise is actually possible. All right, so this is why today I'm releasing KRI. So KRI stands for Kernel Runtime Integrity with eBPF. It's an open source project. There is no ARM support yet. It's compatible with at least kernel 5.15 and plus. So it's available on GitHub today, so feel free to check it out. So instead of going through a boring list of all the features that KRI has to offer, what I'm actually going to do is get in the shoes of an attacker and try to take you through the different steps that an attacker might follow in order to either exploit a flow of the kernel or try to bypass whatever detections we're going to talk about today. All right, so let's talk about the first scenario. So let's say that an attacker controls the address of the next instruction executed by the kernel. So this is a very textbook example of a return object programming attack. These kernel attacks are usually used to try to eventually elevate your privileges and gain root access on a machine when the process actually goes back to user space. So let's go through the different steps of the attack and see what's happening and how KRI can actually help detect these kind of attacks. So the first step is, again, so the attacker is allowed to choose which will be the next instruction executed by the kernel. So let's say that they jump to a stack pivot. So a stack pivot is very simple. The idea is the attacker will be able to choose where the stack pointer will point to, assuming that they have access to and they can control or at least predict the address that will be in EAX or there. And the point is they will actually point the stack of the kernel thread to a user space buffer. And within this user space buffer, they will have prepared the entire rob chain, and little by little, eventually at some point, they will execute a kernel function with attacker control parameters. So over the past few years, and actually a lot of features were added to try to prevent these attacks from working. One of them is called SMAP. So it stands for Supervisor Mode Access Prevention. And what it does is it prevents a kernel thread from using a user space buffer for its stack. So basically, what I've just described will not be possible because of SMAP. SMAP is a bit, it's rated because it's also checking addresses, but the point is, instead of jumping into the stack pivot, I could have tried to jump directly in user space executable memory. And SMAP would have prevented me from actually jumping to user space from a kernel space thread. All right, but for the sake of this talk, let's say that SMAP and SMAP are disabled. And also, let's say that the route chain was eventually updated to call commit creds of prepare kernel cred of 0. So basically, what these two functions do is they upgrade the credentials of the current thread and eventually make the current thread root. Okay, so what can we do for machines without SMAP and without SMAP? Well, the very first thing that comes to mind is to put a kprobe on prepare kernel cred. So what this does, okay, so just like before I get into the details, kpreps are a type of programs, of eBPF programs, that you can use to attach an eBPF program to an exported kernel symbol. What this means is whenever this kernel symbol is called, the eBPF program will be triggered first. So what we can do is put a kprobe on that symbol and then check if the stack pointer, the frame pointer, and the instruction pointer are actually pointing to user space memory. All right. So what you can see here is simply, so it's a vulnerable kernel module that I had to load in order for the demo to work. But basically what you can see is that here there is an offset that is actually controlled by the attacker, and they can use this offset to move wherever they want in the kernel and choose what the next instruction is going to be and what the next instruction that the kernel is going to execute will be. All right. So this kernel module was loaded. So let's jump into a machine and then start cry. Here you go. And then eventually, exploit the bug and see the rootkit in action. All right, perfect. So I've configured cry to ship all the logs and all the alerts to Datadog. You could actually have used any kind of any log monitoring platform. It's OK. The logs are generated in a JSON file. And yeah, if you update the page, you'll see that a new log was sent, which is a register check event. And then you have context about the process that triggered this detection. And then eventually you get like the hook point on which the detection was made. And then you clearly see that the stack pointer here is in user space, which is a detection that something weird happened. All right. So it sounds great, it does work, but it's simply like smap and smap on a budget. And the reason for this is because you need to hook all the functions called by kernel exploits for this to work. The other problem is blocking mode only works on 5.3 kernels and plus. And the reason for this is because if you want to actually block these kind of things, you need to kill the thread. And in order to kill the thread, you need a helper that was introduced in 5.3 kernels. Another problem with this is if an attacker knew that you were using kprobes to actually detect this, all they would try to do is prevent the kprobe from firing in the first place. All right, so game on. What would an attacker do to disable a kprobe? Well, as far as I know, there are three main ways to disable a kprobe. The first one is to use kprobe's enable interface. So I'm going to talk about this one later. The second one is to use sysctl to disable ftrace enabled. So this is a global kill switch for all the tracing subsystems of the Linux kernel. And the last one is to kill the user space process that actually loaded the eBPF programs. Well, let's try to booby trap everything, right? I'm not going to talk about the last one a lot because it's probably the noisiest option and probably not the one that attackers are going to try to do first. So I'm just going to go over the first two ones. All right, so let's talk about the first one. So kprobes enabled is a global kill switch to disarm all kprobes on your machine. If you look at how it works, eventually it will call the write enabled fireball hook point and symbol, and you can actually update the rope chain to do that yourself. So what you could do is use your rope chain to eventually try to disable all the kprobes before jumping to the commit threads function. All right, so let's put a kprobe on it as well. Well, the problem is, even if you did put a kprobe on it, if an attacker knew that you were using kprobes, again, there is another way to bypass kprobes, even without going through the pain part of calling write enable fireball. And the way you can understand how to do it is simply by looking at the bytecode at runtime. So on the left here, you can see that this is the bytecode of the function without a kprobe, and on the right, this is with a kprobe. So what's happening here is that when a kprobe is actually loaded, the bytecode is rewritten to call to some address that is actually a subsystem of the kprobe feature, and then this subsystem will actually call your eBPF program. So if an attacker knew that you were using this to check the registers, what they could do is simply jump 5 bytes later and then bypass the call to the kprobe. Well, again, game on. What do you do next? The cool thing is kprobes can actually be added and hooked at multiple offsets past the symbol that you care about. And technically, you can actually put many of them. So the point is, in order to prevent them to prevent the attacker from being able to jump past the call to your kprobe, what you can do is load multiple instances of them and then do that far away inside the function so that the attacker is deterred to ever try to call the function at all. All right, so that could work, but what else could they do past this and to try to bypass this again? Well, if you look at what write enable file bold does, it actually writes 0 or 1 to a global variable called kpreps all disarmed. So if you, the attacker could try to write 1 or 0 directly to kpreps all disarmed. So it won't necessarily disable the kpreps that are already loaded, but at least it will prevent you from loading new ones. And the bad thing is with eBPF, you have no way to hook anything, right? Because you don't have any symbols, you don't have any program types that is able to just hook on memory that is being updated. So there is nothing you can do. Well, actually, almost. What you can actually do is use a perf event program type to periodically check the values of all sensitive kernel parameters. So perf events are usually used to collect hardware metrics on your processes, but you can actually configure it to trigger periodically. So that's what cry does. All right, so let's talk about the second way of disabling kpreps. The other way to do it is to use the sysctl interface. The good news is there is an entire BPF program dedicated to sysctl. And unfortunately, it was added in 5.2 kernels. So if you want to do these kind of things for all the kernels, you're going to have to use kpreps again. But the point is, with this program type, you can actually detect when a parameter is about to be changed and preemptively change the value or block the call entirely. Almost all sensitive sysctl parameters are checked by cry periodically. All right, so let's say that whatever you did so far did not work and the attacker was able to work around your detections and eventually became root on the machine. What they're likely going to do after that is try to persist their access and also modify the kernel runtime to hide their tracks. The way they do it usually is by using kernel modules, and then within the kernel module, try to hook syscalls to change the output of a syscall, basically. The way to hook syscalls, there are a bunch of ways to do it, but mainly it's usually based on kpreps or by hooking the syscall table directly. Another thing that kernel rootkits have been doing the past few years is use BPF filters to try to tap into the network traffic, or they could also just not use a kernel module at all and do everything using eBPF programs. We actually had a talk last year about this, so if you are interested, we wrote and published an entire eBPF-based rootkit. All right, so what cry does because of all of this is actually monitor everything I've just talked about. So any kind of BPF operation will generate an alert, any kind of kernel module load or deletion events, any kind of kprop registration or disarm events, and so on. And more importantly here for the next demo, execution of hooked syscalls. So cry is able to detect, again, with the periodical check trick, that the syscall table was hooked just by looking at the address of the handler of a syscall. If it is outside of the kernel text, so if it is, for example, inside of the module code, it will trigger an event. And then also, if the handler changes over time, it will also trigger an event. Another way and cool trick of cry is that it is able to detect when a process is about to execute a syscall that was hooked. And again, you can configure cry to either log or kill the process that is about to do that. All right, so again, this is the kernel module. As you can see, it was modified to on init, just this is a basic syscall table hook method, but override the syscall handler to be our own syscall handler. And then if you look at the configuration file of cry, you'll see that I've configured it to log whenever the syscall table is hooked and also kill the process that might try to execute a syscall that has been hooked. So for this demo, I wrote a basic web server, and then if you call the books endpoint, you'll get a list of books. And to answer this list of books, the server has to issue an open syscall. All right, so let's start cry and then insert the module that I just talked about. Perfect. And then let's jump into Datadog to see what logs were pretty much immediately generated. So eventually you'll get 2 of them, perfect. So the first one is init module, so it's simply that a new module was loaded, you have the name of the module and the process that did it. And then if you look at the hooked syscall table, you'll see clearly that the open syscall was hooked. It used to be x64 sysopen, and now it is our sysopen inside the virtual device module. So let's go back to our web server and then issue the request again and see what happens now that cry is running. Perfect, and as expected, the process was killed, and you would have another notification in Datadog. All right, so another way to detect rob chain attacks is control flow integrity. So CFI is a very well-known feature of many programs that lock down the execution flows within the kernel by controlling call sites at runtime. So they are usually added at compile time, but sometimes they are added in hardware as well. And CFI is a great way to control and to prevent rob attacks because it prevents you from jumping wherever you want inside the kernel, which is basically what rob attacks do. These features, unfortunately, are not always available, specifically the hardware ones. So, like, what can we do with eBPF? Well, instead of trying to lock down all the call sites, what we can do with eBPF is lock down jumps between control points. So both hook points and parameters are checked. And basically, the idea is you can't reach a low-level function that will eventually upgrade your credentials if you've not gone through first a syscall that is linked to credentials update, and then through the Linux security module, so like the LSM interface that is basically handling all mandatory access control. So unfortunately, I won't have time to talk about this further, but the goal is to catch malicious calls to sensitive functions and also to detect logic bugs, specifically for access rights. So for example, let's say you open the file as a read-only, and eventually you get, you end up writing to it, for example. The bad news is that it's a very tedious process. It's not automated, contrary, which is like, not the same for, which is the case, sorry, for any other usual or normal CFI tools. And also, like the hook point, you have to work around the hook point limitations because, again, not all functions within the kernel are exported, which means that you cannot hook everywhere technically with eBPF. I also talked briefly about enforcements. So basically, CRY will try to enable the blocking features whenever they are available. So it's either program types or eBPF helpers. And every detection we've talked about today are configurable to either log, block, kill, or paranoid. So log, block, kill are pretty much self-explanatory. Paranoid means that whenever a detection triggers, all the processes are going to get killed, again, only if the right helper is available on your kernel. All right, so when it comes to performance, so I use the Linux kernel computation time to evaluate the performance of CRY. And the reason for this is because it spawns a lot of processes, which means that it's a very good stress test for CRY. And as you can see, if you enable all the features of CRY, well, you can have a pretty significant overhead on the kernel, so up to 40% in the total execution time. However, if you disable just one detection, which is the one that checks at runtime when a syscall that is about to be executed, if this syscall has been hooked or not. So if you disable just this hook and just this detection, you go back to less than 1% overhead, which is totally fine for, and actually in the same margins than other CFI tool out there. All right. So thanks a lot. That's it for me. I think the three takeaways for this talk first that eBPF can be used to write powerful detections. However, eBPF might not be the ideal technology to detect kernel exploits for all the reasons that I've talked about in the talk. Also, more realistically, CRY is a last resort. It's not really a bulletproof strategy. However, there is value in trying to make attackers' lives harder, and there is value in trying to, just make exploits harder to use, and definitely try to make out-of-the-box rootkits fail for script kiddies, for example. All right, so again, the repository is open source, so feel free to check it out. And I'm down, so I'm ready to ask questions.